Alright class, welcome back. Tonight we're going to finish our notes from factor and solve by grouping. And when we're factoring by grouping, there's a couple of things that we need to make sure that we are have everything set up right. Alright, the first thing we're going to do, guys, is when you do this, you're going to make sure that your polynomial is written in standard form, and that means you want your exponents in descending order from the highest number to the lowest number. So that's one thing you've got to make sure before you do factor by grouping. And the second thing is, okay, you're going to separate the first two terms and the last two terms, and then you're going to use the greatest common factor rules to factor these. So let's look at an example. So here's an example I have. I have x cubed plus x squared plus 2x plus 2. I have four terms. It's in standard form, so I can go ahead and try to factor this. So I'm going to just rewrite this here so it's a little bit easier for me to do. So the first thing to do is I'm going to separate the first two and the last two. So I draw a little line there. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to look at the first two here. What is the greatest common factor between x cubed and x squared? Well, I know that my GCF is x squared here for these two terms. Okay, so my GCF of these two is x squared, so I want to divide x cubed by x squared and x squared by x squared. So I put what I divide on the outside and what's left. So x cubed divided by x squared is x, and then x squared divided by x squared is plus 1. So I have factored out the first two terms. So my next step is to look for the GCF of the last two terms. Okay, so my GCF of the last two terms is 2, so I want to divide both of those terms by 2, 2x divided by 2, and 2 divided by 2. So remember, I put what I divide on the outside. 2x divided by 2 is x, 2 divided by 2 is plus 1. So now that I have done my factor by grouping, I've factored each pair here, my goal is to get one common thing in parentheses. So whenever I factor these out, when I get these two parentheses, I need these to be the same. So I see that I do. I have x plus 1 and x plus 1, so I write that down. That becomes one of my factors, and then my other factors is what's left on the outside of the parentheses. So the second factor becomes x squared plus 2. So when I factor these out, I'm saying, okay, I cannot factor x plus 1 out anymore, or x squared plus 2. I can't factor that anymore. So I know that this is factored completely. So I can't do anything else to that. But now, if I want to solve this polynomial, this is where we just go back and we set the factors equal to 0. Okay, and we would solve this. So I'd have x plus 1 equal to 0 and x squared plus 2 equal to 0. So here I'd subtract 1 and get x equals negative 1. Here subtract 2. Subtract 2, I have x squared equals negative 2. We all know that now we have to take the square root of both sides. Square root of negative 2, so I get x equals the square root of negative 2. And we know we can't have that negative, so this is just equal to plus or minus. We're going to have to do this. I radical 2. So my answers here would be x equals negative 1, I radical 2, and negative I radical 2. So this is that polynomial solved. So I factored it, now I've solved it. Okay, so let's look at another example. Okay, so here I have 6x cubed minus 9x squared plus 4x minus 6. It's in standard form. My exponents are going from highest to lowest, so I can go ahead and begin factoring by grouping. Okay, so the first step is to separate the two. So I've separated the first two terms and the last two terms. Now I need to determine my GCF of both sets of terms. Okay, if I look at my first set of terms, I notice that my GCF is 3x squared. 3 goes into 6 and 9, and x squared goes into x cubed and x squared. So I divide everything out. So I put on what I'm dividing out on the outside of the parentheses. 6x cubed divided by 3x squared gives me 2x. 9x squared divided by 3x squared gives me minus 3. So that is this first two terms factored completely. Next step is to determine the GCF of 4x minus 2. I'm sorry, 4x minus 6. So here the GCF is 2. So again, I would divide everything in this term by 2. Write that on the outside. 4x divided by 2 is 2x. 6 divided by 2 is minus 3. So my goal here, guys, again, is to get one thing in common. They must be the same. So I have 2x minus 3 is one of my factors. And then my other factors is what's on the outside of the parentheses. Is 3x plus 2. 3x squared plus 2. Alright, so I look at 2x minus 3. I cannot factor anymore. 3x squared plus 2 cannot factor anymore, so this is totally factored. So that is that equation factored. Okay, so I factored that polynomial, and let's solve it. So to solve it, remember we said each factor is equal to 0. So I have 2x minus 3 equals 0. And then I would add 3 to both sides. And then I get 2x equals 3, divide by 2, and I get x equals 3 halves. So I have the other factor here set equal to 0. So I have 3x squared plus 2 equal to 0. Subtract 2, subtract 2. I wind up with 3x squared equals negative 2. Then I would divide both sides by 3. And I get x squared equals negative 2/3. Take the square root of both sides to get rid of the x squared. And I wind up with x equals, can't have this negative in the radical, so we know to bring that out, plus or minus I, and then square root of 2 over 3. So my answers here would be x equals 3 halves, I to radical 3, and negative I to radical 3. Remember, they come in pairs, so we always have plus or minus. So that is this problem solved. Okay, so example number 2, again written in standard form, x cubed plus x squared plus x plus 1. Split it in 2. Find the GCF of x cubed plus x squared, then the GCF of x plus 1, and factor those out. So if I look at the GCF here, I know the GCF is going to be x squared. Divide everything by x squared, and I wind up with x plus 1. That side is factored out. The GCF between x plus 1 is 1, so I factor out 1, divide everything by 1, and I have x plus 1, and no plus here. So again, my goal is to get some of the things in the parentheses to be the same. Went a little too far there, so just right here and there. So these are the same. So I have x plus 1 times x squared plus 1. Okay, I can't factor these out anymore, so I know that this is totally factored, and now I'm ready to solve. Okay, and remember, to solve, we just set these equal to 0. I set this one equal to 0, and this factor equal to 0. Subtract 1, I get x equals negative 1, and here do the same. Minus 1, x squared equals negative 1. Take the square root of both sides, and I get x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 1, which is equal to plus or minus I. So my answer to this one was x equals negative 1, I, and negative I. So that's my answer there. So this is that problem solved. So I know how to factor, and I know how to solve. Okay, let's look at our last example here. Is x cubed plus 2x squared minus x squared minus 2. Again, in factored form, or I'm not in factored form, I'm sorry, in standard form, and just split it in 2 and look for our GCF. So look here, x cubed and x squared. I know my GCF is x squared. I'm going to divide both by x squared. Put that on the outside of the parentheses. X cubed divided by x squared is x. 2x squared divided by x squared is just plus 2. Okay, and I look here, my GCF here between here is going to be a negative 1. So I'm going to divide by negative 1, negative 1. Put that on the outside, minus 1. And I'm going to have x squared, negative x gives me x. Negative 2 divided by negative 1 is plus 2. So I have my common factors there. I have the same, so I have x plus 2, and then x squared minus 1. Okay, so now I look, are these totally factored? X plus 2 I cannot factor, but this looks familiar to me. This is what we have here, is a difference of squares. Okay, remember how we factor that. We write that as the square root of this and the square root of that, and plus or minus. So this would be x plus 2. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 1 is 1, so it will be plus 1 and then minus 1. So now that is totally factored. So now I have 3 factors. Set these equal to 0. First thing I know is that, again, this is totally factored. Now I want to solve. So I set these equal to 0. So this becomes x plus 2 equals 0, x plus 1 equals 0, and x minus 1 equals 0. So this would be x equals negative 2, x equals negative 1, and x equals positive 1. So my answer here would be x equals, we put them in order, negative 1, 1, and 2, and here is my answer solved. Okay, so we should be able to factor a polynomial by grouping today and factor it and solve. Make sure you write down any questions you have, complete the form at the end of the video, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks, have a good night.